Three Lives by Tuesday Love Sang Rampa. Read for you by BlueFriend in beautiful BC. Chapter 3. But what happened to Leonidas Manuel Mollygrubber? Did he go out like a light which has suddenly been switched off? Did he expire like a blown-out match? No, not at all. Mollygrubber, lying in his hospital bed, feeling sick enough to die, was thoroughly upset by that priest. He thought how unpriest-like it was for the man to turn redder and redder in the face, and from his position lying in the bed, it was very clear to him that the priest intended to jump at him and choke him, so Mollygrubber sat up suddenly in an attempt to protect himself, while perhaps he could scream for help. He sat up suddenly with a supreme effort and drew the biggest breath that he could under the circumstances. Immediately he felt a terrible rasping, racking pain across his chest. His heart raced like the engine of a car, the gas pedal of which had been pushed hard to the floor while the car was standing in neutral. His heart raced and stopped. The old man felt instant panic. What was to happen to him? What was the end? Now, he thought, I'm going to be snuffed out like a candle I used to snuff out as a boy at home, in the only home he had known as an orphan. The panic was terrible. He felt every nerve was on fire. He felt as if someone was trying to turn him inside out, just like he imagined a rabbit must feel if a dead rabbit could feel when his skin is being pulled off, preparatory to putting the rabbit's body in a pot for cooking. Suddenly there was the most violent earthquake, or such is what he thought it was, and old Mollygrubber found everything swirling. The world seemed to be composed of dots like blinding dust, like a cyclone whirling round and round. Then it felt as if someone had grabbed him and put him through a wringer or through a sausage machine. He felt just too terrible for words. Everything grew dark. The walls of the room, or something, seemed to close in around him. He felt as if he was enclosed in a clammy, slimy rubber tube, and he was trying to wiggle his way out to safety. Everything grew darker, blacker. He seemed to be in a long, long tube, a tube of utter blackness. But then, far away in the distance, in what undoubtedly was the end of the tube, he saw a light. Or was it a light? It was something red, something changing to bright orange, like the fluorescent life jacket he wore when street cleaning. Frantically, fighting every inch of the way, he struggled along, forcing his way up the tube. He stopped for a moment to draw breath and found that he was not breathing. He listened and listened, and he couldn't hear his heart beating, but there was a queer noise going on outside, like the rushing of a mighty wind. Then, while he remained without movement of his own volition, he seemed to be pushed up the tube, and gradually he reached the top. For a time he was just stuck there, held in the end of the tube, and then there was a violent pop, and he was flung out of the tube like a pea out of a pea shooter. It spun around sideways and end over end, and there was nothing. No red light, no orange light either. There was not even any blackness. There was nothing. thoroughly frightened, and feeling in a most peculiar condition, he reached out with his arms, but nothing moved. It was just as if he had no arms. Panic set in once again, so he tried to kick out hard with his legs, trying to touch something, but again there was nothing at all. He could not feel any legs. He made a supreme effort to have his hands touch a part of his body, but so far as he could tell, he hadn't any hands. He hadn't any arms. He couldn't sense his body. He just was, and that's all. A fragment of something he had heard long ago before came back into his consciousness. It was something referring to a disembodied spirit, a ghost without form, without shape, without being, but existing somehow, somewhere. He seemed to be in violent motion, but at the same time he seemed not to be moving at all. He felt strange pressures. Then, of a sudden, he felt that he was in tar, hot tar. Long ago, almost beyond the edge of his memory, he had, as a small boy, been hanging around while some men had been tarring a road. One of the men, perhaps not having very good sight, or perhaps in a spirit of mischief, had tipped a barrel of tar from the open top of the barrel, and it had fallen all over the small boy. He had been stuck, hardly able to move, and that was how it felt to him right now. He felt hot, then he felt cold with fright. Then he felt hot again, and all the time there was the sense of motion, which wasn't motion at all, because he was still. He was still, with what he thought the stillness of death. Time went on. Or did it? He didn't know. All he knew was that he was there in the center of nothingness. There was nothing around him. There was nothing to his body, no arms, no legs. And he supposed he must have a body, otherwise how could he exist at all? But without hands, he could not feel the body. He strained his eyes, peering, but there was nothing to see. It was not even dark. It was not darkness at all. It was nothingness. Again, a fragment of thought came to his mind, referring in some way to the deepest recesses of the seas of space, where nothing is. He idly wondered where he had got that from, but no more thoughts on it came to him. He existed alone in nothingness. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear, nothing to smell, nothing to touch. And even had there been something to touch, it would not have helped him because he had nothing with which to touch. Time wore on. Or did it? He had no idea how long he stayed there. Time had no meaning. Nothing had meaning anymore. He was just there, wherever there was. He seemed to be a mote suspended in nothingness, like a fly caught in a spider's web, but yet not like a fly, for a fly is held by the spider's web. Old Molly Grubber was caught on nothingness, which reduced him to a state of nothingness. His mind, or whatever was in place of a mind, reeled. He would have felt faint, he thought, but there was nothing there with which to feel faint. He just was, a something, or possibly even a nothing, surrounded by nothingness. His mind, or his consciousness, or whatever it was that now remained to him, ticked over, tried to formulate thoughts, tried to originate something in place of the awful nothingness which was there. He had the thought coming to him, I am nothing, but a nothing existing in nothingness. A sudden thought occurred to him like a match shining in a moonless night. Some time ago, he had been asked to do a little extra job for pay. A man had wanted his garage cleaned out. Old Molly Grubber had gone there, fished around, found a wheelbarrow and a few garden tools, and then he opened the garage door as the man had given him the key the day before. He opened the garage door, and inside there was the weirdest conglomeration of rubbish old Molly Grubber had ever seen. A broken sofa with the springs coming out, a chair with 2 legs broken, and moths fluttering out of the upholstery. Hung on a wall was the frame and the front of a bicycle wheel. Stacked around were a number of tires, snow tires and worn-out tires. Then there were tools, rusted out and useless. There was garbage which only very thrifty people can ever accumulate. A kerosene lamp with a cracked shade and a Venetian blind, and then, in the far corner of one of those stuffed forms on a wooden stand which women used to use for making dresses, he pulled it all out and carted it down to a bit of wasteland and piled it ready for a garbage collection the next day, and then he went back to the garage. An old bath fixed in tightly beneath a tattered kitchen table lit his curiosity, so he pulled at it but could not move it. Then he decided he would pull the table off the top first. He pulled, and the center drawer fell out. It contained a few coins. Well, old Molly Grubber thought it's a pity to throw them away. They could buy a hot dog or 2. So he put them away in his pocket for safekeeping. A bit further back, in the drawer, he found an envelope with some assorted paper money of different countries. Yeah, he thought, I can raise a bid on these. A money changer will soon deal with that for me. But back again to the bath. He lifted off the table and pushed it outside the garage doors. Then he found a whole load of rotten awnings on top of the bath, and then a broken deck chair came to life. He pulled them all out, threw them all out of the door, and then he could pull the bath into the center of the garage. That old galvanized bath contained loads of books. Weird books some of them were, too. But Molly Grubber dug down until he got all the books out and piled on the floor. Then he found some paperbacks which excited something in his mind. Rampa. Books by Rampa. Idly he flicked over a page or 2. Ah, he said to himself, this fellow must be a load of dromedary droppings. He believes that life goes on for ever and ever. Pwah! He dropped the books on the pile and then fished out some more books. This fellow Rampa seemed to have written an awful lot of books. Molly Grubber counted them and was so astonished at the number that he started all over again and recounted. Some of the books had been ruined because obviously a bottle of ink had upset and trickled over a lot of the books. There was one book with a beautiful leather binding. Molly Grubber sighed as he picked it up. Ink had soaked right into the binding, marring the leather. What a pity, he thought. He could have got a few bucks for that book, just on the worth of the binding alone. But no point in crying over spilt milk. The book was tossed out to join the others. Right at the bottom of the path, there was another book resting in solitary splendor, saved from the dirt, saved from the dust, saved from the paint and ink by being in a thick plastic wallet. Molly Grubber bent down and picked it up, pulling it out of the plastic wallet. "You forever," he read. He flipped over the pages, saw there were some illustrations inside. On some sudden impulse, he slipped that book into an inside pocket before going on with his work. Now, in his peculiar state of being in nothingness, he recalled some of the things in that book. When he had got home that night, he'd had a can of beer and a big lump of cheese, which he had bought from the supermarket, and then he put up his feet and read here and there from the book, "You Forever." Some of the things seemed so fantastic to him that eventually he had just flung it away into the corner of the room. Now, though, he bitterly regretted not reading more, because he thought that had he done so, he would have had a key to his present dilemma. Round and round his thoughts swirled like dust motes in a vagrant breeze. What had the book said? What did the author mean when he wrote this or when he wrote that? Wonder what had happened. Molly Grubber recalled sourly how he had always opposed the thoughts of life after death. One of the Rampa books, or was it a letter which he picked up in the garbage, suddenly came to his mind. "Unless you believe in a thing, it cannot exist." And another, "If a man from another planet came to this earth, and if that man was so utterly strange to humans, it is even possible they would not be able to see him, because their minds would not be able to believe or accept something which was so far out from their own points of reference." Molly Grubber thought and thought, and then he thought to himself, "Well, I'm dead, but I'm somewhere. Therefore, I must exist. So there must be something in this life after death business. I wish I knew what it was." As he thought that, the stickiness, or the tarriness, or the nothingness, the sensations were so peculiar that he could not even think what they could be. But as he thought of the possibility that he might have been wrong, then he was sure that there was something near him, something that he could not see, something that he could not touch. But he wondered, is it because he could now possibly accept that there was life after death? Then again, he had heard some strange things. The fellows up at the depot had been talking one day about some guy in a Toronto hospital. The guy was supposed to have died and got out of his body. Molly Grubber could not recollect exactly what it was, but it seemed to him, as far as he could remember, that a man had been very ill and had died, and had got out of his body and seen some astonishing things in another world. Then, to his rage, doctors had revived his dying or dead body, and he had come back and told some newspaper reporter all about it. Molly Grubber suddenly felt elated. He could almost see forms about him. Suddenly, Poor Molly Grubber sat up violently and reached out his hand to stop that confounded alarm clock. The bell was clanging as it had never clanged before. But then he remembered he was not asleep. He remembered that he could not feel his arms or his hands or his legs either, for that matter, and all about him was nothingness. Nothing at all, except the insistent, reverberating clanging, which might have been a bell, but it wasn't. He didn't know what it was. While he was still pondering that problem, he felt himself move at terrific speed, incredible speed, but then again, it wasn't speed at all. He was not educated enough to know about different dimensions, third dimension, fourth dimension, and so on. But what was happening was that he was being moved in accordance with ancient occult laws. So he moved. We will call it moved because really it's very difficult to portray fourth-dimensional things in three-dimensional terms of reference. So let us say he moved. Molly Grubber sped along, faster and faster it seemed to him, and then there was something, and he looked about him and saw shadowy forms. He saw things as though through smoked glass. A little time before there had been an eclipse of the sun, and one of his fellow workers had handed him a piece of smoked glass and said, "Look through that, Molly, and you'll see what's happening around the sun, but don't drop it." As he looked, the smoke gradually disappeared from the glass, and he looked down into a strange room, looked with horror and increasing fright. Before him was a large room which had many different tables. They seemed to be like hospital tables, with all sorts of adjustments to them, and each table was occupied by a corpse, a naked corpse, male and female, all with that bluish tinge of death. He looked and felt sicker and sicker. Horrible things were happening to those corpses. Tubes were being stuck in at various points, and there was that ugly gurgle of fluid. There was also the rattle and chug of pumps. He looked more closely in terrified fascination, and saw that some of the bodies were having blood pumped out, others were having some sort of fluid pumped in. And as the fluid went in, the body turned from its horrid bluish tinge and became exaggeratedly healthy in color. Remorselessly, Molly Grubber was moved on. He passed an annex, or cubicle, in which a young woman was sitting beside one of the tables, making up the face of the female corpse. Molly Grubber was quite fascinated. He saw how the hair was waved, the eyebrows penciled and the cheeks rouged, and then the lips were given a rather too vivid red. He moved on and shuddered as he saw another body, which apparently had just come in. On the eyes, which were closed, there were peculiar cone-shaped metal pieces, which, he surmised correctly, were to hold the eyelids down. And then he saw a vicious-looking needle being pushed through the bottom gum and up through the top gum. He felt decidedly sick as the man who was doing the work suddenly thrust an instrument into the corpse's left nostril and seized the point of the needle, jabbing it straight through the septum, after which the thread was pulled tight to hold the jaws together to keep the mouth shut. He felt definitely queasy, and if he could have, he would have been thoroughly sick. He moved on, and then, with great shock, he saw a body which, with difficulty, he recognized as his own. He saw the body lying there naked on a table, scrawny, emaciated, definitely in poor condition. He looked with disapproval at his bowed legs and knobbly knuckles. Near him was a coffin or casket, or more accurately, just a shell. The force moved him on, and he went through a short corridor and moved into the room. He was moving without any volition of his own. In the room he was stopped. He recognized 4 of his fellow workers. They were sitting down, talking to a well-dressed, smooth young man who had in his mind thoughts all the time of how much money he could get out of this. "Molly Grubber was working for the city," said one of his former colleagues. "He doesn't have much money. He has a car, but it isn't worth more than $100. It's a beat-up old clunker. I suppose it served him well enough, but that's all he's got. That car, which would fetch about $100, and he's got a very ancient black and white TV. Now that might fetch from $20 to $30. Apart from all that, all his other effects, well, I don't suppose they'd fetch $10, which doesn't leave much room for paying for a funeral, does it?" The smooth, well-dressed young man pursed his lips and stroked his face, and then he said, "Well, I should have thought you would raise a collection for one of your colleagues who died under such peculiar circumstances. We know that he saved a child from drowning, and for that he gave his life. Surely someone, even the city, would pay for a proper funeral?" His colleagues looked at each other, shook their heads, and fiddled with their fingers, and then one of them said, "Well, I dunno, the city doesn't want to pay for his funeral and set a precedent. We've been told that if anything is paid by the city, this alderman and that alderman will rise up on their hind legs and bray out a lot of complaints. No, I don't think the city will help at all." The young man was looking impatient and trying to conceal it. After all, he was a businessman. He was used to death, dead bodies, coffins, etc., and he had to get money in order to keep going. Then he said, ostensibly as an afterthought, "But wouldn't his union do anything for him?" The 4 former colleagues almost simultaneously shook their heads in negation. "No," said one, "we've approached them, but no one wants to pay out. Old Molly Grubber was just an ordinary sidewalk sweeper, and there is no great publicity if people give to his funeral." The young man rose to his feet and moved to a side room. He called to the men, saying, "If you come in here, I can show you different caskets, but the cheapest we could do an interment would be $250, and that would be the very cheapest. Just the cheapest wooden shell, and the hearse to take it to the burial ground. Could you raise $250? The men looked thoroughly embarrassed, and then one said, "Well, I guess we could. We could raise $250, but we can't give it to you now." "Oh, no, I'm not expecting you to pay now," said the young man, "provided you sign this form guaranteeing payment. Otherwise, you see, we might be left bearing the expense, and that, after all, is not our responsibility." The four colleagues looked at each other rather expressively, and then one said, "Well, okay, I guess we can spring up to $300, but we can't go to a cent more. I'll sign the form for up to that." The young man produced a pen and handed it to one of them, and he hastily signed his name and put his address. The other three men followed suit. The young man smiled at them now that he had the guarantee form, and he said, "We'll have to be sure of these things, you know, because this person, Mr. Mollygrubber, is occupying space, which we badly need, because we have a very thriving business, and we want him removed as quickly as possible, otherwise charges will be incurred." The men nodded to him, and one said, "See ya," and with that they moved out to the car which had brought them. As they drove away they were very subdued, very quiet, and very thoughtful, and then one said, "Guess we shall have to get the money together pretty quick. Don't want to think of old Molly stuck in that place." And another said, "Just think, poor old devil, he worked for years sweeping the sidewalks, keeping his barrow in better condition than any of the others, and now he's dead after saving a life, and no one wants to accept the responsibility, so it's up to us to show a bit of respect for him. He wasn't a bad fellow after all, so let's see how we can get the money together. Do you know what we're going to do about the funeral?" There was silence. None of them had given much thought to it. In the end, one fellow remarked, "Well, I suppose we shall have to get time off to see him properly put under. We better go and see the foreman and see what he's got to say about it." Mollygrubber drifted along, seeing the city that he knew so well. He seemed to be like one of those balloons that sometimes flew over Calgary, advertising a car firm or other such things. He drifted along and seemed to have no control on where he was going. First he seemed to emerge from the roof of the funeral home. He looked down and saw how drab the streets were, how drab the houses were, how much they were in need of a coat of paint. He said a lick of paint. He saw the old cars parked in driveways and at the roadside, and then moved on downtown, and felt quite a twinge as he looked down at his old familiar haunt and found a stranger there, a stranger wearing his plastic helmet, pushing his barrow, and probably wearing what had been his fluorescent red safety jacket. He looked down at the man languidly pushing the broom along in the gutters, and every so often reaching for the two boards which he had held in his hands to lift up garbage and deposit in his barrow. His barrow, too, looked rather drab. It was not as well kept as when he had had it, he thought. He drifted on, looking down with a critical and condemnatory eye at the litter in the streets. He looked at a new building site and saw the excavated soil being lifted up and driven across the city by strong breezes which were blowing. Something impelled him up to the sanitation depot. He found himself floating over the city. He found himself dipping down over a sanitation truck which was just going to collect the barrows and the men. But he went on to the depot, and sank down through the roof. There he found his four former associates talking to the foreman. "Well, we just can't leave him there," said one of the men. "It's pretty awful thought that he ain't got enough money to get in the ground properly, and nobody else is going to do a thing about it." The foreman said, "Why don't we take a collection? It's payday. If we ask each of the men if they'll only give $10 each, we can get him properly buried, with a few flowers and things like that. I've known him since he was a lad. He's never had anything. Sometimes I thought he wasn't quite right in the head, but he always did his job, although a bit slower than most others. Yeah, that's what we'll do. We'll put a notice up above the payout booth asking everyone to give at least $10. One of the associates said, "And how much will you give?" The foreman pursed his lips and screwed up his face, and then fumbled in his pocket. He produced his old battered wallet and looked inside. "There," he said, "that's all I have in the world until I get my pay. $20. I'll give $20. One of the men rummaged around and found amid the garbage a suitable box, a cardboard box. He cut a slot in the middle and said, there's our collection box. We'll put that in front of the paying out booth, together with a notice. We'll go in and get one of the clerks to write a notice for us now, before the others get paid." Soon the men came in from their rounds. The barrows were unloaded from the trucks. The men parked them in their allotted places and put their brooms in the racks ready for the next day, and then, chattering away idly as men and women will when in a throng, they moved to the booth to be paid. "What's this?" asked one. "Our late colleague, Molly Grubber. There isn't enough money to pay for his funeral. How come you guys don't fork out $10 at least? He was one of our own fellows, you know, and he's been on the council staff a long, long time." The men grumbled a bit and mumbled a bit, and then the first man moved to get his pay envelope. Every eye was upon him as he took it. He quickly stuffed it in his pocket, and then at the glares around him, he half-heartedly fished it out again and reluctantly opened one end of the envelope. Slowly, he put a finger and thumb inside, and at last produced a $10 bill. He looked at it and looked at it again, turning it over in his hands. Then, with a great big sigh, he shoved it quickly through the slot in the collection box and moved away. Others collected their pay, and under the watchful eye of all the men assembled, took out a $10 bill and put it in the collection box. At last all the men had been paid. All the men save one had given $10, and he had said, "Gee, no, I didn't know the guy. I only been here this week. I don't see why you expect me to pay for a guy I've never even seen." With that, he pulled his cap more tightly on his head, marched out to his old car, and drove off with a roar and a rattle. The foreman moved to the four men who were chiefly concerned in the matter and said, "How come you don't go and see the top brass? Maybe they'll give a bit. There's nothing to lose. They can't fire you for it, can they?" So the four men marched into the offices of the senior officials. They were embarrassed. They shifted from foot to foot, and mutely one of them held the notice and the collection box in front of one of the managers. He looked at it and sighed, and then took out $10, folded it up, and put it in the box. Others followed suit. $10, no more, no less. At last the rounds were done, And the 4 men went back to the foreman. He said, "Now, you guys, we'll go in to see the accountant, and we'll get him to count it up for us and give us a proper statement of how much it is. That lets us off the hook." End of chapter 3.